Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Environmental Social Justice. I am your host, Wendy Nystrom. Today's guest host is 𝐏𝐿𝐻𝐵𝒈. So thank you so much, Joel, for joining us again today. And our special guest is Tonya Chandler. So Tonya is the Director of Technology, Commercialization, and Regulatory Compliance for BioLargo. Welcome to the show, Tonya.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, and today we're going to talk about something pretty scary. We're going to talk about PFAS and how it is worse than we thought it ever was. So Tonya, please start off by telling us what PFAS is so everybody understands.
Okay, so PFAS are per and polyfluorinated substances. It's a generalized term that's used. If you actually dig in, there's about 4,700 of them recognized by the American Chemistry Council. If you throw in some of the pharmaceuticals and pesticides that fall into that class, there's about 12,000. But the problem is that they don't break down. That's the biggest thing. They've got some good uses. They've got, things that we're very familiar with are PFAS compounds. But when you start digging in, they don't break down. They bind to the proteins in our blood. They can cause birth defects. They can, blow up our livers. They're kind of, some of them are not so nice compounds.
Just your liver, folks, you don't need it. No, in all seriousness, no, this was started in 1937. You have actually a lot of history knowledge on this.
I do. So the first PFAS were developed in 1937 on accident by a guy named 𝐌𝐸𝐸. He worked for 3M. And he was doing some other experiments and happened to come across this compound. And it was a great compound. It had some really great qualities, and it caught the attention of DuPont in about 1945. And they started doing some other work, and 3M began producing a compound called PFOA in 1947. And we know that today as Teflon.
We all use it.
Yeah, so we all use it. And in about 1951, the PTFE that he had first developed and the PFOA got combined together, and DuPont started purchasing that, and it started getting put on pans and created nonstick cookware. The problem is that in 1956, the first study came out that it bound to the proteins in our blood. In 1961, DuPont toxicologist came out and said, hey guys, stuff's toxic. In 1962, they wanted to know how toxic it was. So they got 40 volunteers of their own employees, and they did what they called a cigarette study.
Yeah, you told me about
And they put a minute amount, we're talking about the size of the head of a pin, in cigarettes, and they asked 40 employees to smoke it. 9 out of 10 created flu-like symptoms before they got to the end of the cigarette.
Wow.
So they did a second study, and they went down how minute of amount could they do to, create this flu-like effect that lasted quite a while. And like I said, it turned out it was about the size of the end of a pin that created the flu-like effect. Now, all of these guys have ended up in the hospital and died, by the way. So it's pretty brutal. And then in 1965, they came out with something that said that, this built up in our livers. There's been other studies done with the dangers of PFAS, where later on, as they dug into this, they linked it to birth defects. DuPont still, by the way, had come out and said through all of this, even into the 2000s and 2003, that there is no toxic effect of Teflon from pans or heating it. So
that's not enough.
They still came out with that, although they did, during part of the manufacturing process at one time, remove all of the women from the manufacturing line. As not to cause birth defects in children, until one of them had a child that had birth defects, and then they put all the women back on the line to not be held accountable. So Yeah, it didn't stop there. In 1952, 3M created something called PFOS, which is the main ingredient in Scotchgard.
Okay.
And
That used
you
that a
know,
lot.
yeah, and in 1963, they found that if they created or if they took and combined the PFOS and the PFOA, that it became an incredibly effective way to put out fires. So we created AFFF fire foam, and after the Navy scientists figured this out, and you had the 1967 USS Forrestal fire, it became something that was on every naval ship in our fleet. Because AFFF fire foam is able to suppress vapors, it deprives fuel, the fuel surface for oxygen, and it prevents evaporation. But as once you put it on a fire and it doesn't break down, you now have it in the soil, you have it then seeping into the groundwater, and then we have it in us because they've proven that PFAS goes up the food chain. So if it gets into the groundwater, if it gets into our surface waters, it goes into the fish. And they knew as early as 1970s that PFOA and PFOS were showing up in fish.
Okay.
So it travels. It goes into the fish, and then it goes into the birds, and then it goes into the polar bears. And, it ends up in the water cycles where it ends up in our rain, and it ends up, and now they're finding it in rain around the world. They're finding it in the polar ice caps.
Yeah.
And they're finding it in all of our food. So the question we have to ask is our fabric softener more important than having PFAS in our food? Because that's where you're finding it. You're finding it in our all waterproof makeup. So if you see the term waterproof on your eyeliner, on your mascara, that's a PFAS product. If you Scotchgard, waterproof your, waterproof clothing, if you waterproof your deck, these are all PFAS products.
Still being manufactured and used daily.
There are ones, yes. In about 2000, 3M voluntarily stopped producing the PFOS and PFOA products, or they got voluntold, we'll say, by the
I like
EPA.
that. I like that.
So those, but it wasn't actually, so they stopped making it. And then I believe it was about 2003 that because DuPont owned the rights to it, they started making PFOA again. But then I believe it was 2006 or 2007, they voluntarily phased out the PFOA and PFOS products.
Okay. So it's still, it's still been used up until very recently. 2007.
Yes, and there are still PFAS products used. As I said, fabric softener.
Yeah.
We all like our clothes to stay soft. Well, part of the reason that our clothes stay soft, have you ever noticed that when you wash a towel with fabric softener, it doesn't absorb as water as
That's
well?
why I actually don't use fabric softener on my towels because it doesn't absorb.
Right. And that's because it's designed to, because if you keep the fabric from absorbing things, it stays soft.
Right. Makes sense.
But that's a PFAS product. The powder inside of nitrile gloves that makes them easy to slide on and off.
Yeah.
That's a PFAS product. When we tell people to go out and test for PFAS, when we're working with municipalities or businesses, we say, if you want an accurate sample, you need to send 2 guys out in cotton clothing that has been freshly laundered with no PFAS containing laundry soap or softener. So go back to the basics.
Yeah.
Don't make sure that you're wearing powderless nitrile gloves if you're wearing gloves. Don't put hand lotion on. Don't put sunscreen on. Don't put bug spray on. Make sure that you don't have any Post-it notes next to you because the glue on the Post-it notes contains PFAS. Make sure that you don't have any waterproof notebooks or anything. You can actually take your sample in a glass jar, but make sure it's been etched with acid, washed out with acid, because PFAS sticks to glass.
Oh, Jesus.
And make sure that you're not putting your samples inside a Ziploc bag, because the Ziploc bags themselves do not create or do not have PFAS in them. However, it's used in the manufacturing process. The EPA actually did a study after they came out with their 70 parts per trillion health advisory limit early. And they tested, I believe it was about 20 different foods. So they tested chocolate milk, they tested fish, they tested beef, they tested, chicken. The one that surprised me is they tested a piece of iced chocolate cake. That piece of iced chocolate cake had over 17,000 parts per trillion of PFAS in it.
You ain't taking away my chocolate cake. Not doing it. Not going to happen.
But
I'm out. I'm out.
You ask, why did it happen? Well, because the food, think about what's in chocolate cake. You've got milk in chocolate cake. Well, if the milk contains PFAS, that contains PFAS. If the eggs contain PFAS, that contains PFAS. Did the cocoa beans contain PFAS that made the chocolate?
Yep.
It doesn't break down. So then it builds up. They just did a study off of the coast of Florida and found parts per billion levels of PFAS in the oysters.
No, I love oysters.
Because oysters are bottom feeders. So if the PFAS is in the water and it's connecting, it's hooking up to the organics in the water and then dropping, then the oysters are eating it and filtering it out.
So just really quick, Joel, before you jump in, I'm just going to let the public know, when we talk about things building up and not breaking down, it just adds and adds and adds and layers and more and more and more. So it becomes more concentrated as more PFAS gets into that organism, gets eaten by another organism. And again, so it just builds up and gets to be stronger and stronger and stronger. Just wanted to point that out.
One of the things that we're going to talk about, or that you'll hear us say through all of this, is that the limits are in the part per trillion range. And when the health advisory limits came out by the EPA, it was 4 parts per quadrillion.
Oh my.
Okay, so a part per trillion is the equivalent of, say, a single drop of water in 20 Olympic swimming pools.
Yeah, not much.
Okay. If you talk about a part per quadrillion, you're talking about 4 parts per quadrillion is 4 drops of water in Lake Michigan.
That's a wonderful analogy. That really sets the scene there.
I mean, so your lifetime health advisory limit on PFOA, Teflon, is 4 parts in Lake Michigan.
Bless
you. So obviously there are, bear with me here, there are benefits to the PFAS, like you're talking about when it comes to the flame retardant and, when it's being used for fires and things like this. And obviously there is the negative side as well, which is that once it's here, it ain't going nowhere, kind of like a lot of things. But I hate asking a question like, how do you balance the good and bad? But how do you balance the good and bad? Because you know what I mean? It's like, seriously, because like when you're talking about, a Navy ship that's on fire and you've got to save, all the lives that are on there. And how do you, that's a tricky one.
You're asking for justification.
It becomes a tricky balance, but I think the balance comes in how we manage it.
Yeah.
There's ways to use it and yet still keep it out of our environment.
Okay.
Okay.
So right now what we're facing is we've been putting it into our environment since 1945 with no mitigation measures. So that means we've been putting it into our landfills. It's been in our water, it's been in our wastewater, but there's never been any mitigation measures. So now you're dealing with a buildup.
Yep.
But if we treat it, when you put it into a landfill, well, landfills have had leachate systems for years. So if we treat what's coming off of the landfills, we remove it from going back into the waterways. And that's one of the things that Plan 15 from the EPA, that they just released a Plan 15 guidance. And one of the rulemakings in that is that they're adding PFAS to the discharge limits of landfills going to surface waters.
Yeah.
So if they discharge that leachate directly to a surface water, as some do, they now have to test and treat for PFAS in that leachate. They're also doing a study on that coming in to POTW. So your wastewater system in a city, the landfill discharges to it. They're doing studies so that they can set a limit for that. If we pull the water out of the ground, we can take it out of the ground and we can clean it before it comes to us. We can take a wastewater plant and we can clean the water before it goes back, so we can disrupt the cycles.
Yeah.
And
So
if we
then-
disrupt the cycles, we can start minimizing where it goes.
But then my question for that would be, and bear with me here, and I'm not, so you're taking it out of the system, and this is something that doesn't break down. Where do you put it? What do you do with it?
So there's several technologies, and that's where the technology hasn't quite caught up yet with the science. There are so PFAS are made up of the carbon fluorine bonds, and carbon fluorine bonds are some of the strongest in all of chemistry. It takes exorbitant amounts of energy to break them down.
Yeah.
So when we start talking about technologies that are used for breaking them down, you start talking about things like high pressure, high temperature oxygen called supercritical water oxidation. Well, one, the average city is not going to put that in because it's millions of dollars. But two, you're talking high pressure, high temperature oxygen that can cause some safety concerns. There's a slightly less critical version called HALT, which adds alkalinity to it to try and balance out what you create. But again, you're still talking about millions of dollars on installations. However, there are some other technologies that remove it quite effectively. BioLargo has one that's called an aqueous electrostatic concentration unit. A lot of mouthful, but basically what it does is it takes it out like fly paper out of water. So it sticks it to a disposable process, and we take that out and we dispose of it. Carbon systems on the high end, granular activated carbon, will actually remove it from the water. Ion exchange will actually remove it from the water. Then you deal with the disposal. EPA and everybody's not quite there yet on the disposal, so they say store it right now and let technology catch up. Many people are working on it, on how to dispose of that. Incineration is still an option, but the DoD has put a moratorium on that until we can get better incineration processes so it doesn't go up into the air.
Yeah.
Because they did a study in New York on the basic, so biosolids from a wastewater plant have typically always been spread land application or they incinerate. Land application becomes a little difficult if it's PFAS laden, and the government right now is looking at adding this to the CERCLA list, which means it super fun. Yes. So hazardous constituents. So once that goes forward, it's a game changer for everything, because if you land apply this now and it contains PFAS, now you've created a Superfund site out of a farmer's field.
Yes. This is happening. This is developing.
This is developing. So they look at incineration. Well, they did a study out in New York on incinerating biosolids from a wastewater plant that contained PFAS. And while they found that they could partially break down the PFOS and PFOA, which were the two major concerns, they created the short chains, which are the PFBS and the Gen X. They created Gen X in the process. So they're like, well, we better wait and figure out how to scrub this out first before we actually, go forward. So about 5 states have actually created incineration laws where they haven't banned it, but they have put some really strict regulations around it that really will inhibit the ability to incinerate it in the short term. I believe in the long term, we'll probably go back to some incineration processes, just like they did with 1,4-dioxins and everything else. They'll go back to a very strict way to do it. A lot of scrubbers, a lot of safety measures. It'll probably have to be done at a hazardous waste recre facility What it does mean is that a lot of the technologies that some of the municipalities are putting in, like activated carbon and ion exchange, will get a lot more expensive to operate because the disposal of the PFAS-laden
And
material
transportation.
will go through a lot more expensive process to dispose. But that is still all very ambiguous yet. The processes around this. So what we do know that the EPA is doing to regulate this is that they're starting on the manufacturing side. They're putting significant new use rules in, saying that you can't just, if you stopped using a PFAS, you can't just start using it again without going through EPA study. They're banning some of the PFAS in the manufacturing processes where you can't manufacture a process using a specific PFAS. They're also doing this with certain pesticides that are fluorine containing. States like California, I believe Colorado and Minnesota have already put forth or are in the process of putting forth legislation that says you cannot sell PFAS containing products in our state as of whatever date. So they're banning it in consumer goods. They're banning it in cosmetics. You can't manufacture with it. So the states are taking proactive approaches. They're looking at, like I said, CERCLA. The comment period on the CERCLA legislation actually closed November 6th. It's expected to have its final rule in August
Okay.
of
August is when
2023,
things
which
change. Yeah.
yeah, so they're expecting to have the final ruling published in August. That would add it to the hazardous constituent list of CERCLA, which would change everything, because once it's on that list, then everything PFAS containing will be treated as RCRA, even though that isn't there yet.
Yeah.
Because it means changing the way we transport PFAS laden material. Nobody's going to want to land apply it because nobody wants to become a Superfund site. You start to look at, do we, if it goes into RCRA, which the legislation is already sitting on the Office of Budget and Management's desk for RCRA, and they looked at adding it to Appendix 8 as a hazardous constituent there, then everything just gets treated with kid gloves. You are now dealing with a hazardous substance. Safe drinking water rules are coming out in March to set limits. Now the health advisory limits are set really low. Don't expect that the drinking water limits will be that low. They could, but they still have to consider the economic part of this. So everybody's expecting that they'll be right around like 3 or 4 where the lab detection limits are.
So it's obvious to me, listening to you, that you have a lot of knowledge on all this stuff.
Oh yeah, expert.
I mean, it's kind of mind blowing because I'm sitting here with some of this going, say what? But I guess I kind of want to go, if I can. I know we're running short on time here, but I wanted to ask really quick: how did you get started in this, and what made you want to get started looking at this?
Oh, okay, well, there's 2 reasons for this when this came out. One, when I started at BioLargo, this was just starting to be the emerging contaminant. And they had just created, through the help of an SBIR grant from the EPA, when they did a call for innovation, BioLargo had created their aqueous electrostatic concentration product, but they had never commercialized this. So it was my job to commercialize it. To commercialize it, I needed to learn about it. But in the process of learning about it, it became personal. I lived less than a mile from a landfill growing up. Our water was actually contaminated from the landfill, and they actually had to move us all over to city sewer and water because of that contamination.
See,
and now I wonder if it causes some of the health issues that I have. So that it became personal.
But I think, and I mean, and I'm not trying to like belittle this or like make fun of it, but like, that to me is the part that I think is so fascinating to me, is when you're able to look back on your life and realize how things from your past correlate to where you are now. And you know, you're now researching, and you've gotten a very serious education on something that you had no idea, and chances are your family had no idea about. And so it's like, that to me is very fascinating, just to see how things kind of come full circle like that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
Part of
Tonya.
my job is to keep up with this every day. So I wake up in the morning, I grab my coffee, I sit down at my desk, and the first thing I do is look up what's happened in PFAS legislation and, what studies have come out for PFAS.
Okay, please tell me you're like meditating before you do this, because that's just like a rough way to start the day, or at least
It's
do it.
rough, but she's a scientist. I mean, she's got that brain power to want to investigate this.
It's just, that's a lot for a first cup of coffee in the morning. That's a lot for the first cup.
Hey, you've got Wonder Woman. I've got Star Wars, so.
Oh, I like that it said take naps at the bottom. Respect. Okay, now we're good. Now we're good. Okay.
I do want to bring full circle when you brought up the landfills. So this started in the 40s, started getting dumped into our environment in the 40s. Most leachate pits, so people who don't know what a leachate pit is, when you have a landfill, fluid will come out. It's usually put into a pit. It dries out, and then the solids are scooped up. A long time ago, those pits were not lined, meaning whatever got into the pit just seeped into that soil and groundwater, and it just magically went away, because back then the solution to pollution was dilution. That's no longer the case. We know that's wrong. So when these, pits were being leached out, they leaked, got into our soil and ground, got into our food. PFAS is now literally in absolutely everything. It's in our rainwater, it's in our lakes, it's in our streams, it's in our blood. I think there's actually been a recent test that they randomly tested, 10, 15 people. PFAS was in their blood system. So
it's actually in at levels that are more than the health advisory levels for most people.
There you go. So this is a bigger deal than we thought. It's sort of like, as we previously mentioned off camera, it is an environmental cover-up. There are things that need to be done. So Tonya, since we are closing out in our last 4 minutes, how do people find you? How do they work with you? How do they hire you? Because you are leading the pack with this kind of cleanup. I mean, there's a lot y'all are doing.
Okay, so if they want to find me, we have a great website that we created, and you can get to me through there. But it's literally www.bestpfastreatment.com.
Brilliant. That's the marketing person in you coming out right there.
So, there's information about our product, but there's an email link on there for more information, and that goes directly to my inbox. So reach out. I'm happy to answer questions for people. We're happy to come in and give educational seminars. My life is PFAS. So
if you were to give somebody a quick tip, because I'm all about the quick tips, on like what's one thing that they could do. Obviously, educate yourself on what PFAS is, because that was huge for me. But just when you're surrounded by your detergent, your pots and your pans, it's everywhere. What's something that somebody can do?
Well, one of the things that we can do is just be conscious about, be conscious about what's going into your body, but also be conscious of what you're doing. So do I need the fabric softener? Can I go to a more natural version of the fabric softener, maybe that I make myself? Can I not throw that plastic bottle in the actual trash and throw it into a recycle bin so that it's actually taken care of properly? I mean, all of this helps. And then talk to your municipalities, talk to your regulators. If you work for a business, talk to a business that says, hey, are we conscious about what we're putting into our wastewater stream, what we're putting into solid waste, and have some environmental stewardship about what we're doing.
I love that. I absolutely love that your response was just be conscious of what you're doing. I think that is like the best advice that you can give anybody, no matter what it is, but especially when you're talking about this, that is so big for people. It's like, just think, just stop and think for a second. Like,
absolutely.
That's the easiest thing you can do for most people.
For most people.
We'll leave it at that.
Well, on that, I will thank you so much, Tonya. Thank you for the wealth of information and the fact that it's scary stuff, but at least now we know, we're educating ourselves, and we're going to, hopefully fix this problem and hold those accountable for their actions when they knew what they were doing. That's a different story. But fortunately, y'all are coming back, and you're going to be doing part 2 of this PFAS discussion, ways to clean it up, ways to make things better. So that will be coming to y'all next week. And I will leave. Oh, Joel, stop it.
You're saying y'all. You're not from the South.
I know. I've been hanging out with Greg Gill too much. He uses it all the time. So on that, guys, thank you so much. I'm Wendy Nystrom, your host with Environmental Social Justice, with my co-host Joel Vendette and our very special guest, Tonya Chandler with BioLargo. Thank you guys so much. We'll see y'all next time. I did it again. Bye.
Bye.